afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the National Security Council. My name is Layla Abdelaziz, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Katie Hammer, Taylor Kerr, and Alex Newbecker. We know that while the backdoor involved in the November 21st cyber attack on a Qatari water treatment plant was a US government asset that was misappropriated, we now know that the malware was developed and deployed by a domestic organization known as the People's Militia, a group that seems to be motivated by class issues. To coordinate a whole of government response, the National Security Council should convene a cyber unified coordination group per PPD 41, given that a US-based activist group has publicly accepted responsibility for the malware and the French government has ceased cyber relations with the US government. I will now pass it to my colleague Alex to provide our assessment.
I'll be going over our strategy, our knowns and unknowns, and our assessment. We will be investigating the identities of the individuals involved in the People's Militia. We will remediate the risk of the backdoor by developing a patch and work with affected foreign countries to secure their systems and handle the political damage with France and the EU. Then we will anticipate potential escalation of this incident, potential retaliation, and secure US critical infrastructure. Moving towards the knowns and unknowns, we know the People's Militia leveraged the US backdoor and attacked QEWC with malware that's not directly associated with the US government. They then released the knowledge of the backdoor into the wild to increase attacks against Qatar and the UAE and other entities who use UMA. What we now know is that this has led to attacks in both Algeria and Lebanon. The US government developed the backdoor to support long-term collection objectives and spread through compromise update with the assistance of a CIA asset. Due to Belt and Road Initiative technology transfers, the backdoor then spread outside of China. The Qatari government arrested an American citizen in connection with the QEWC attack. Qatar alleges the citizen gave technical information to activist groups who then conducted the attack. We developed the backdoor, but not the malware. France has sought to end collaboration between the US and EU in cyberspace. What we don't know is the level of exposure of US critical infrastructure that may leverage UMA software and the extent to which nuclear power plants, hydroelectric power stations, and other critical infrastructures in Belt and Road Initiative states are affected. Moving towards our assessment, the US government developed the backdoor to collect information, but did not develop the malware. Given the US development of the backdoor, efforts should be focused on developing a patch for it. China has deployed a patch domestically, but efforts to distribute it externally have been hampered. Entities have been taking advantage of this backdoor, attacking targets around the world. With the dispersal of the backdoor through Belt and Road Initiative countries, there's a large target base for both state and non-state cyber actors. The US must obtain a copy of the malware from Qatar, China, or from the People's Militias within the United States to develop a patch to defend domestic and international industrial control systems. I'll now turn it back over to Layla.
Thanks, Alex. I'll dive into some of our investigation recommendations. First, immediately, the FBI should take lead on investigating the People's Militia, including collecting intelligence from members. This investigation should also aim to receive a copy of the malware in order to support a potential patch to the malware. ODNI should continue to monitor foreign threat actors and coordinate intelligence to the National Security Council. Additionally, the FBI should lead on coordinating updates and information sharing with FBI attachés around the world and with foreign partner law enforcement agencies. And in the long term, State Department and Department of Justice should strengthen information sharing agreements with allied and partnered nations to improve capacity for future cyber coordination. I'll now pass it to my colleague, Taylor.
Thank you, Lila. Lila's explained our policy recommendations relevant to investigation. I'll be expanding on our remediation and mitigation efforts. Our policy recommendations will serve to repair and fortify our technical infrastructure and our diplomatic standing and halt global proliferation of the backdoor and further use of the malware. In the immediate term, DHS and the NSA must leverage the expertise available within the private sector and within the intelligence community so that we can offer all due assistance to provide patches of the UMA backdoor and of the malware leveraged by People's Militia so that we can prevent and neutralize the backdoor and the payload from causing further damage. Once patches are available, US CERT and CISA will take lead on pushing these patches out to effective partners. US CERT will be our lead for outreaching to its counterparts in foreign nations like QCERT in Qatar or CISRT in Chile, and other Belt and Road Initiative partners who are affected by this backdoor. CISA will take the lead in pushing out the patches to domestic partners and US critical infrastructure. CISA in particular will be liaising with critical partners like the DC-3, like the FBI and NSA, and also working with key ISACs in the area of critical infrastructure and state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. We also recommend to the National Governors Association that they prepare cyber capabilities in their National Guards for assistance in pushing these patches out to all levels of critical infrastructure at all capability levels, respecting relevant authorities, of course. So that China is not emboldened to engage in opportunistic aggression because of the loss of US collection in Taiwan, we recommend the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State issue immediate statements to the effect that the US supports stability and peace in the Taiwan Straits and Taiwanese democracy to deter any opportunistic aggression. We also recommend that POTUS engage in immediate personal outreach to the Emir of Qatar and the President of France to assure these key US allies that our commitment to maintaining peace and not attacking critical infrastructure during peacetime remains strong, and also offering US capabilities to help mitigate proliferation and help promote resilience is offered. In the near term, Department of State should work with the Gulf Cooperation Council so that our key partners in the region like Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia are aware of measures they can take to promote their own resilience. We will engage specifically the cyber working group so that they're aware of measures that they can take and so that we can mitigate any hard feelings in the region. We also recommend leveraging soft power abilities to put repudiation of attribution, particularly of our responsibility for the malware, in local media networks like Al Jazeera, so that more trusted voices can spread the news, not just to allied governments, but also to the general public that is watching these events closely. In the long term, we recommend strengthening US-French cyber dialogues as soon as we have remediated the initial fallout and strengthening that relationship. We recommend promoting acceptance of the UNGGE 2021 report, which the US has committed to, so that China can join us in committing not to attack critical infrastructure during peacetime. And we also recommend earmarking funds so that our Build Back Better World partners have access to independent cyber evaluations and cyber resilience funds during their partnerships with the US. I'd like to pass this now to Katie to discuss our further recommendations.
Thanks, Taylor. So I'm going to briefly go through our anticipation recommendations, given that a lot of the information we've received is dependent on ongoing investigations, both domestically and abroad. So we recommend the following responses to acknowledge both the fallout consequences from US government involvement and the continued further escalation of this incident abroad. In the near term, we recommend alerting Cyber Command's protection teams and USAID's Office of Disaster Relief to provide assistance to our non-US critical infrastructure partners. We also, as my colleagues have mentioned, should alert FEMA and the appropriate National Guard units in case these attacks spread to US critical infrastructure. CISA should issue an alert to critical infrastructures partners to build resilience. ODNI should alert the appropriate agencies of the potential retaliatory responses from both non-state actors and state actors. And in the long term, something we want to highlight is recommending implementing cyber impact assessments, both at the forefront and at the end, to sort of balance the considerations in the vulnerability equities process. And we also recommend referring this incident to the Cyber Safety Review Board for lessons learned. And we also recommend incentivizing critical infrastructure partners via tax credits to build the baseline level of cybersecurity throughout our essential systems. I'm going to turn it back to Layla now.
Thanks, Katie. As we discussed, the NSC should launch a cyber UCG to coordinate a whole of government response, given the impact of this incident on US interests and threat to critical infrastructure. The US should continue to emphasize our commitment to public safety as we offer assistance to allies and impacted countries. Finally, the FBI should immediately arrest relevant People's Militia actors and issue public statements related to the criminal investigation of this group's attack on a foreign ally's critical infrastructure. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to discussing our recommendations.
Great, thank you so much, Cyber Squad. We can jump straight into Q&A from the judges now. Nick Anderson, do you have any questions that you'd like to lead with?
Yeah, I think my first question is, we're explicitly in messaging to the heads of foreign governments, identifying, our commitment to the norm of not attacking critical infrastructure during peacetime. What are the implications that you think for your policy recommendations for how we need to prepare critical infrastructure owner operator community domestically for the threat of attacks on critical infrastructure during wartime as a norm?
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. If I understand correctly, we're talking about the implications of the US stance on not attacking critical infrastructure and how that implicates our response to domestic critical infrastructure.
Yes.
Very good. I'll address the commitment that we've made specifically and pass the baton to Katie later to talk about our response. So the specific commitment that the US has made is relevant to the UN GGE report in 2021, where the US and other relevant nations stated that responsible state behavior in cyberspace does not include attacks to civilian infrastructure during peacetime. That's a commitment that the US has made. China has not signed on to this report. Russia, notably, has signed on to this report, but China has not. And so we believe that emphasizing this in our public communications allows the US to present itself to the world as a more responsible actor in cyberspace. This is particularly important for our relations with France. But relevant to our messaging to domestic critical infrastructure, we are aware that other states have not made similar commitments. Katie, would you like to expand upon this?
Yeah, we also recognize the international law implications here with regard to whether there's, the differences in sovereignty, use of force, those sort of things. So we recognize the sort of discrepancy here and the gap in terms of how our response and the way in which we communicate with our allies and partners reflects sort of the way in which we will continue operating in cyberspace. With regard to building up critical infrastructure, as you've noted, in communicating, we really want to leverage CISA's abilities to push that to the public sector and private sector specifically, as we know that a lot of the US critical infrastructure domestically is owned by the private sector. I'm happy to expand further, and I hope that I addressed your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just to pick up on that, so you mentioned CISA having this very strong role in bringing out a patch, and I'll leave aside the impact of a patch. I have a feeling Megan wants to dig into that a little bit, but how is CISA going to distribute this? How are they going to verify the actual usefulness of a patch? And if you can discuss a little bit, should the US be working with Chinese companies on patching and mitigating vulnerabilities, and your policy process and decision-making process in making that decision?
That's a good question to discuss because we're in a bit of an unusual situation relevant to a US prepared backdoor on a Chinese company, which is different, of course, from previous instances like Eternal Blue. Let's discuss, I'll talk about CISA's role in pushing out a patch, and then I'd like to pass to Alex to talk about the particularities with the development of the patch framework. CISA will be issuing alerts to critical infrastructure and to the private sector so that they're aware of the risks to their systems posed by both the backdoor and the malware. We know more about the backdoor at this point because it was developed by the US government. And so we presumably have much greater ability to prepare a patch for that particular threat than we do for the malware. So CISA can put out relevant technical details and push those out through its alerts, through partnerships with DC3 to our national security infrastructure, and push that out as well through ISACs and other critical infrastructure associations. Alex, can you talk about development of the patch and particularities relevant to the backdoor and the malware separately?
Of course. Thank you, Taylor. So luckily, we're not starting from scratch, seeing as we did develop the backdoor, right? So we do have the vulnerabilities equities process that can give us some insight into how that backdoor was created. And so we would recommend that the NSA and CISA can help mitigate that process through helping to develop a patch. That said, we could also leverage intelligence capabilities to go and try to capture China's patch they're currently utilizing. However, we, again, aren't starting necessarily from scratch because we did develop the backdoor itself. So the NSA and CISA can help mitigate the backdoor with private industry and help deliver a patch to affected US domestic and critical infrastructure areas.
So I have two
Thanks, Al.
questions. If we're back here again tomorrow, what is the most likely reason that we are? What went wrong? And the situation's worse, not that it's better.
Question about further escalation. Lila, would you like to address reasons that we would invoke PPD 41 and our reasons for collaboration?
I think there's two scenarios here. First, there's further blowback on our diplomatic relationships. We've worked very hard to secure partnerships all over the world, including on the law enforcement level. So with France's actions here, also going further to try to recruit other nations to also step away from their relationships with the US on cyber coordination.
So what does that look like, in terms of what is France going to do that tomorrow you're going to be back briefing us tomorrow?
France just stepped away from its presidency on the Council of the European Union. So I think it has a lot of leverage with other EU member states and could potentially lose key assets and law enforcement partnerships there. We want to maintain our access to these partnerships, A, for coordination, B, for credibility on the global level. So I think it's very important to get ahead of this and to really invest in State Department resources and even using the administration and the president to not only communicate to the American people, but to the world and to people in impacted countries that the United States does not attack critical infrastructure, is not behind this particular attack, and is here to support our allies.
Okay, thanks.
I have two questions, and they're related. So you listed that we don't know the depth of the use of this software in critical infrastructure in the United States, but you laid out a lot of very substantial investment in mitigating something that you don't know how big it is. How are we going to find out whether that's an investment worth making first? And the second one is your long-term recommendation was to incentivize tax credits to get critical infrastructure to build their overall security and resilience activities. How are you going to navigate that? Is this federal tax credits? Most of this, these are state regulated critical infrastructures. So walk me through your thinking there.
Thank you, Ms. Stampley. I'll talk first about the development of the patch, and Katie will expand upon the use of critical infrastructure tax credits. On the reasons that we would develop a patch, there's, as Lila mentioned, the credibility issue. We're pushing out a patch, even this doesn't target our specific critical infrastructure, helps our credibility on the international stage if we're seen putting out the fire instead of letting China do the work and do it poorly. I will add that there are some ways that we can find out the level of US exposure. If we're talking about our national security infrastructure and the defense industrial base, we'd be relying on things that came into being with Executive Order 14028, which implied that software bills of materials will help us understand the software that is at use within the federal government and our national security infrastructure. We also note that US military assets like Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar depend on foreign critical infrastructure for their survival. And so besides just giving them measures for their own resilience, we also need to make sure that foreign critical infrastructure continue to function, not only for the lives of the civilians that depend upon it, but for our military and other assets that depend upon it as well. So there is certainly exposure to these attacks, even if they're only occurring abroad and in Belt and Road Initiative partnerships. Countries that are Belt and Road Initiative partners are also US allies, countries like Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Katie, can you talk about our civilian tax credits?
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize something that my colleague Taylor mentioned, like the Pentagon alone relies on 2.5 million ICS systems alone, and that's not even considering the spread of ICS systems within the private sector. So it really is in our best interest to at least understand the full volume of potential impacts here. We don't want to run into like another situation where we're unprepared and we're reactionary instead of preemptive. So in terms of tax credits, like the state issue is a really good point, but we understand that we have to sort of think of creative ways other than mandatory requirements for, especially within the 16 sectors of critical infrastructure, ways to get these companies on board. CIS has done a great job in providing educational and resource type activities, but we want to sort of push that up a level where there's an incentive for these companies to establish baseline measures of cybersecurity so that when situations like this arise, as we know, like small, middle, and local governments are actually at most risk. They have no cyber capabilities or very little. And so we need to be able to sort of bring them into the fold into, thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you to Cyber Squad. We're going to jump.